Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Graeco-Aegyptiaca talk. For our newcomers, if there are any, this lecture series is organized by UCL's Greek and Latin and the Palladion, which is a small civil association based in Budapest. For the past 3 years, we have been coming together monthly throughout the year to explore the many ways the Egyptian, Greek, and Roman cultures were interconnected in the ancient world. The recordings of most of our events are available on the website and on our YouTube channel if you happen to miss them. And you can also subscribe to our mailing list if you'd like to stay informed about upcoming events. Our speaker today is Jessica Lightfoot, a lecturer in Greek literature at the University of Birmingham. Her work focuses on Greek and Roman literature and history, but with particular interest in the literary and scientific cultures of the classical Hellenistic periods. She has published widely related to these topics. Her book, Wonder and the Marvelous from Homer to the Hellenistic World, was published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press. And her second one, Strabo, followed this January in Bloomsbury's Understanding Classic series, providing a new examination of Strabo's and impact in antiquity and beyond. In lecture, Jess will take us to a different subject, goats and the Egyptian town of Mendes, through Pindar's allusions, and explore his integration of Egyptian motifs, religious and cultural frameworks. Jess, if you feel ready, we'd love to hear your talk.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carter, and for everyone involved with both Palladion and Graeco-Aegyptiaca. Thanks for inviting me here today, and thanks everyone for coming to listen. I should just start by stressing, right from the beginning that I am not an Egyptologist at all. I'm a classicist, supposedly, at least by training, at any rate. And I have been fascinated by Graeco-Egyptian cultural interactions for a long time now, especially in the classical and Hellenistic periods. And today I'm going to be talking about a very short, somewhat peculiar fragment of classical Greek poetry, which I hope to show opens up a much larger and more vibrant world of Greco-Egyptian interaction in the classical period. So the fragment I'm talking about today is by the classical lyric poet Pindar. He's, of course, a writer well known both in antiquity and today for his eponytions. These are praise poems for athletes and their patrons that were created to celebrate the victories in famous ancient athletic events, such as the Olympic Games. And the fragment I'm interested in today, fragment 201, which you can see on this slide, isn't actually from one of these eponytion poems. It's not from one of these poems which Pindar is most well known for. In fact, we don't actually know what type of poem this fragment is from. That's just one of the questions that I'm sort of interested in today and thinking about a little bit, but it's not the only one. There'll be more on that later. But as you can see here, it would be good to just start with looking at this fragment of Pindar. So fragment 201 consists of only 3 lines, 3 short lines. But as many of you know, 3 lines for a Pindaric fragment is actually much more to work with than many of the other shorter Pindaric fragments that we have. And some of those only consist of a couple of words. So we don't have much here to work with, but there is some things we can do with this, and certainly some things we can do with the text in which this fragment has been found. So as you can see, just looking at the translation here, this fragment is a rather peculiar one. In it, the poet talks about the Egyptian town of Mendes, which he says is on the Nile, and he tells us that in Mendes, as he puts it, goat-mounting he-goats mate with women. So here we have a very enigmatic fragment by a classical Greek poet who seems to be talking about bestiality involving goats in Egypt for some reason. And as we're going to see, it's not immediately clear from the places in which this fragment is found why Pindar is interested in this poem. So that's all we have of the actual poem. What else can we say then from the context in which we find this rather raunchy fragment? As we're going to see, there are in fact quite a few mentions of Mendes and its goats in ancient Greco-Roman sources. We find explicit citations or references to this precise fragment in at least 3 other extant texts, though the amorous goats of Mendes, which form the subject of Pindar's lines, are also referred to more obliquely in a few other sources from antiquity as well. Unfortunately, despite the fact we have quite a few mentions of this fragment and various other mentions of Mendes, we do not possess any real detail about various aspects of the context of this original Pindaric poem. E.g., we don't know anything certain about its dating, where it was first performed, or indeed precisely what type of poem it was. And although I can't claim to form any concrete conclusions today about any of these matters, I do hope to illuminate certain aspects of how we might go about tackling and interpreting enigmatic Pindaric fragments and the source text in which they're found, and also in exploring Graeco-Egyptian cultural relations alongside Pindar's wider engagement with Graeco-Egyptian cultural exchange. So let's see what we can do with the limited information that we have. The 3 lines of Pindar fragment 201 are all found cited in full in the 17th book of Strabo's Geography, in the midst of a survey which the Augustan geographer gives us of the Nile Delta. Book 17 of the Geography, of course, is the book in which Strabo is focusing primarily on Egypt. So the town of Mendes, which is an important trading post in the eastern delta, which lies on the now silted up Mendesian branch of the Nile, was known as Djedet by the ancient Egyptians and as Tel el-Ruba today. And it's mentioned simply in passing by Strabo in this discussion. He doesn't spend much time talking about this settlement, but he does give us this Pindaric fragment as part of his mention of this town. So if we examine Strabo's words in full here, we note that in his account, there's only 2 pertinent details really that emerge about Mendes in passing. First, we're told that the god Pan is worshipped in Mendes along with a male goat. And then Strabo gives us the 3 lines which make up the Pindaric fragment 201, and he attributes them explicitly here to Pindar, as you can see on the slide. So at first glance, Strabo's poetic citation here seems strongly to suggest that Pindar's original poem had something to do with the Greek god Pan, and that his mention of Mendesian goat bestiality was somehow also connected to Pan. And this may indeed be the case, but as we shall see, I think that there are perhaps more grounds for some ambiguity about this point than Strabo's citation of Pindar's lines suggests when they're examined out of context. So there's 2 other places in the ancient Greco-Roman literary tradition where we find mention of this Pindaric Mendesian poem, and these are places in which it's explicitly connected to Pindar. There are some other mentions, as I said, elsewhere of this supposed connection between Mendes and goats, which seem to also relate to this Pindaric poem. But we have these 3 sources, Strabo being the first. The second is this passage you see here by Aelius Aristides in his Egyptian discourse. So this is another text dealing with Egypt. It's a treatise by Aelius Aristides, who is a 2nd century AD imperial Greek rhetorician. And in this treatise, he deals with a vexed question which many Greek sources before him had often discussed, and that's about where the true sources of the Nile actually lie. So in this longer discussion, this longer convoluted discussion about the true sources of the Nile, Aristides takes the poet Pindar to task for his lines on Mendes, but somehow, strangely, he seems to focus on the least juicy bit of the text. He fixates not on the goat bestiality that we've seen in that fragment. Instead, he is very concerned with the sort of geographical fuzziness and which Pindar shows in these lines. He's not interested in highlighting the human caprid love which they contain. So instead, as I said, Aristides focuses on Pindar's geographical description. Aristides had himself visited Egypt, we know this, so he has this autoptic knowledge of the country, quite an extensive experience of Egypt and its geography, and he disagrees with Pindar's description of Mendes. He explicitly says that Pindar's description of it as being by the cliff or by the bank of the sea is incorrect, because the town, as Aristides knows, is actually located far away from the sea. So this is actually technically correct. Aristides' objection here, his pedantic objection, is correct in as much as Mendes isn't right by the sea. It's indeed situated inland, though one suspects that Pindar's original words reflected the fact that the Egyptian town was a well-known trading hub, and so conceptually it was connected to the Mediterranean via the Nile very closely. And rather than intending to be a literal record of the geographical location of an Egyptian settlement, Pindar is using poetic license here and reflecting the kind of link between Mendes and the sea and trade in the Greek imagination. However, if we ignore Aristides' geographical literal mindedness in this passage and take the wider context of his discussion into account, we can see that his complaint here is not merely a pedantic whinge about Pindar's slightly inaccurate geographical knowledge. Instead, this mention of Pindar comes in the midst of a much longer discussion about the general reliability of Greco-Roman poets' accounts about Egypt. And in this particular passage, it concerns Homer's account of Egypt in particular. So Homer becomes the example of the first Greek poet who's very much misunderstanding and misselling Egypt in certain ways in the Greek imagination. In this passage, Aristides argues that only the Egyptians themselves can be trusted when it comes to Egyptian history and Egyptian customs, since they have long kept meticulous written records, while the Greeks, and especially the Greek poets, have a long history, as I've said, of misrepresenting and poetically embellishing their accounts of the country for their own reasons. So although Aristides focuses narrowly on Pindar's seeming mistakes in the realm of Egyptian geography in this particular discussion, the broader context of this passage and its interests and ideas about poetic truth and embellishment might give us pause when it comes to considering the 3 lines of Pindar fragment 201 that remain to us from Strabo. Here the question then becomes, is Aristides' learned second sophistic audience presumably familiar with the bigger, wider Pindaric poem that Aristides is referring to here? Are they meant to extrapolate a sort of broader objection to the account of Mendesian goat activities that poem contained? If Aristides is being deliberately coy about the finer intricacies of cross-species goat copulation, possibly because of its somewhat indecorous nature, we may be right in suspecting that the orator means to attach an air of suspicion to the veracity of Pindar's account as a whole about Mendes and its famous animals. At any rate, there was one thing that's important to note here, and it's the fact that the Greek god Pan is not mentioned in connection with Mendes or with Pindar's poem in Aristides' account. If we turn now to the third mention of fragment 201 that remains to us from antiquity, it's very much this aspect of Pindar's lines, the ones avoided by Aristides, that are instead the center of attention for the Greek writer Aelian, who's a Miscellenistic writer of the 2nd to 3rd centuries AD. So buried deep within his Miscellenistic work on the nature of animals, which, as the title suggests, is a text which explores the often peculiar behavior of animals and their similarities and differences from humans, we find Aelian turning to the subject of the world's most lecherous animals. And here, as you can see, he notes that both baboons and male goats are particularly notorious for their lust. He then adds that the latter animals were even said to mate with women, and that this matter is something which Pindar in particular marvels at in his work. Here again, we then have a seeming reference to Pindar in connection with women loving he-goats, and undoubtedly this again is a reference to the Mendes poem cited in Strabo, i.e. Pindar fragment 201, although the town of Mendes is not here mentioned explicitly. And in fact, Aelian, as he tends to do, gives us a somewhat erroneous and salacious impression of what Pindar was interested in that poem, telling us in this passage, making it seem as if male goats anywhere in the world might mate with women, not just these specifically Mendesian goats in Egypt. We should note again as well that once again, the Greek god Pan is not mentioned here in connection specifically with this particular Pindaric poem. So in light of the fact that, strictly speaking, Strabo alone mentions Pan in relation to Pindar's poem, we must now return to the geographer's text and try to understand why he seems to be making this connection. We know that in the earlier Greek literary tradition, there is one other famous discussion of Mendes and goats, which Strabo undoubtedly knew, and that is, of course, in the histories, the work of the 5th century Greek historian Herodotus. In fact, in Book 2 of the Histories, as many of you will remember, Herodotus embarks on a rather convoluted discussion of the significance of both goats and sheep in Egyptian culture within his larger famous treatment of Egyptian religion and its connections with and differences from Greek religion. So in that book, Herodotus's interest in goats and sheep begins at Histories 2.42, and there he turns to a very thorny religious question. Why is it that in Egypt, the Thebans sacrifice goats, but never sacrifice sheep, while those in the Mendesian nome sacrifice sheep, but will not sacrifice goats? The historian then provides the Thebans' supposed explanation for their avoidance of sheep, framing their answer in thoroughly Hellenized terms by saying, and I quote the translation here, "The Thebans and those by the Theban example will not touch sheep," and they give the following reason for their ordinance. Heracles, they say, would by all means look upon Zeus, and Zeus would not be seen by him. At last, being earnestly entreated by Heracles, Zeus contrived a device whereby he showed himself displaying the head and wearing the fleece of a ram, which he had flayed and beheaded. It is from this that the Egyptian images of Zeus have a ram's head, and in this the Egyptians are imitated by the Ammonians, who are colonists from Egypt and Ethiopia and speak a language compounded of the tongues of both countries. It was from this, I think, that the Ammonians got their name too, for Amun is the Egyptian name for Zeus. The Thebans then hold rams sacred for this reason and do not sacrifice them. But on one day in the year at the festival of Zeus, they cut in pieces and flay a single ram and put the fleece on the image of Zeus, as in the story. Then they bring an image of Heracles near to it. Having done this, all that are about the temple mourn for the ram and presently bury it in a sacred coffin. So as you've just heard, Herodotus' mythical explanation of the Theban sacrificial customs thus ties their avoidance of goats to the figure of Zeus Ammon, the ram-headed Egyptian version of the Greek king of the gods, who would presumably have already been somewhat familiar to the historian's 5th century Greek audiences because of his importance in the Greek colony of Cyrene in northeastern Libya. The story of Heracles' vision of Zeus wearing a ram costume thus both explains Theban religious custom and provides an idiom for the ram-headed Egyptian form of Zeus for Herodotus' Greek audiences. However, this discussion is not the end of Herodotus' interest in the place of sheep and goats in Egyptian religion. Immediately after the story of Heracles and Zeus's ram costume, the historian first detours into a famous excursus at 2.43 to 45 about the huge number of different Heracleses that exist across the world in different locations and cultures, providing us with yet another insight into his own autoptic research methods when he tells us that he once visited Tyre in Phoenicia to visit the temple of Heracles there and find out about their version of the deity, who must be the Phoenician god Malkart. So after this Heraclean digression, in which Herodotus famously once again mentions the extent of his own personal travels, he then returns at 2.46, as you can see on this slide here, to the second half of his original inquiry: why do those in Mendes sacrifice sheep but refuse to sacrifice goats? So this is where we first find an extensive explanation of the supposed relationship between Mendes and Pan. And again, I'll just read the translation here. This is the reason why the Egyptians of whom I have spoken sacrifice no goats, male or female. The Mendesians reckon Pan among the 8 gods, who they say were before the 12 gods. Now, in their painting and sculpture, the image of Pan is made as among the Greeks, with the head and the legs of a goat. Not that he is deemed to be in truth such, or unlike to other gods, but why they so present him I have no wish to say. The Mendesians hold all goats sacred, the male even more than the female, and goat herds are held in a special honor. One he-goat is most sacred of all. When he dies, it is ordained that there should be great mourning in all the Mendesian province. In the Egyptian language, Mendes is the name both for the he-goat and for Pan. In my lifetime, a monstrous thing happened in this province, a woman having open intercourse with a he-goat. This came to be publicly known. So Herodotus here declares that the Mendesians consider Pan to be one of the oldest Egyptian gods, and he also notes that Pan is often associated with goats among the Greeks. The Mendesians also seem to worship Pan because they consider all goats to be sacred and worship one he-goat in particular. This goat is treated as an avatar of the god, and his death causes communal mourning, like that of the more famous Apis bull. This then, according to Herodotus, is why the Mendesians supposedly sacrifice sheep and refuse to harm any goats. So this Herodotean account thus seems, at least at first glance, to provide the missing link when it comes to Strabo's citation of Pindar's lines on Mendes. According to Herodotus, the Mendesians worship Pan. In the Greek tradition, Pan is a lascivious god associated with goats. It is no surprise then that in Mendes, Pan's animal supposedly pursues the local women, and this then is what Pindar's poem must have been referring to in the lines cited by Strabo and others. And this is certainly one interpretation of fragment 201, but there are a couple of other elements that I believe need examination and which should give us pause before we jump too firmly to any conclusions. The first concerns Strabo's very distinctive attitude towards Herodotus in Book 17 of the Geography, and the second is the many peculiarities which ensue if we examine the actual Egyptological evidence of cult worship in the town of Mendes. I'll begin with Strabo first, since I'm on a much surer footing when it comes to his text, in contrast to the Egyptological evidence. So in my recent book on Strabo, I was mostly concerned throughout with the geographer's self-fashioning as an Augustan age scholar, obsessed with claiming his place in the Greco-Roman literary critical tradition. What emerges from my study is the fact that Strabo is totally immersed in the world of Hellenistic textual and literary critical scholarship, and that he has a consistently antagonistic relationship towards his exegetical, geographical, and historical forebears. Book 17 of the Geography, as I've said, the work's final book in which we find the citation of Pindar fragment 201, is almost entirely taken up with a lengthy account of the geography, history, and culture of Egypt. Strabo himself is familiar with Egypt. He spent time studying in Alexandria, as he tells us, as a young man, and he evidently also travelled around the country, visiting various famous locations. Book 17 is by far the most autoptic book of the geography, perhaps not surprisingly, and Strabo consistently makes a fuss of his own personal knowledge and experience of several different Egyptian locations throughout this book. With this in mind, it will probably come as no surprise to hear that Book 2 of Herodotus' Histories looms particularly large in Book 17 of Strabo's Geography, as does the figure of Herodotus as the archetypal travelling Greek historian who has taken his inquiries on the road with him. For Strabo, the Egyptian Herodotus becomes both an ideal exemplar and the ultimate antagonist. There's hardly a passage in Book 17 which fails to engage somehow with either Book 2 of the Histories itself or with the idea of Herodotus as the ultimate travelling historian. For the most part, Strabo's strategy when faced with the cultural legacy and influence of Herodotus is to either augment and correct the work of his predecessor without acknowledging any debts to the histories in the process, and frequently without naming Herodotus, or the other option is to make a gigantic fuss about how spectacularly he has surpassed the work and travels of his forebear. For example, only towards the very end of his discussion of Egypt does Strabo actually deign to address his predecessor head-on and by name, choosing a distinctly unflattering tone to do so while offering a very pointed barb about Herodotus's reliability when he declares that both Herodotus and others talk rubbish about many things, adding fantastical material to their accounts, like a kind of melody or rhythm or seasoning. Elsewhere, the criticism of Herodotus is more implicit, but nonetheless pointed, and often takes the form of the historian's work or claims being augmented and or corrected. A spectacular and slightly amusing example of the latter strategy is Strabo's insistence in Book 17 that he has travelled the length and breadth of Egypt in a way that far surpasses Herodotus's famous travels. For example, at 17:150 of the geographer makes a point of telling us that he has travelled down the Nile all the way to Philae, a settlement on an island that lay just above the first cataract of the Nile. And the first cataract itself was situated just above Syene, modern Aswan, a city which, along with the island of Alephantine, had long marked the border between Egypt and Ethiopia. Of course, in the histories, Herodotus had revealed at 2.29 that the very limit of his Egyptian travels had seen him reach the city of Elephantine as an eyewitness, though he fails to travel any further into the territory of the Ethiopians. The trip to Philae, described by Strabo in the geography, therefore constitutes a literal advance on Herodotus's travels and suggests that going beyond the historian in both a geographical and scholarly sense is one of Strabo's primary motivations in his own accurate and autoptic description of Egypt and its environs. And this is typical of Strabo's agonistic attitude towards Herodotus throughout his work. We have to bear all this in mind then when thinking about Strabo's citation of Pindar when he mentions Mendes. Though he does not mention Herodotus explicitly in this account, as is common when he's using the historian as a source and agreeing with him rather than correcting him, there's no doubt that he is aware of Herodotus's discussion of the Egyptian town in History's Book 2, and that he is drawing on this account for his claim that Pan is worshipped there by the Egyptians. What is the purpose then of Strabo's addition of the lines from Pindar which provide corroborating evidence for Herodotus's claim that Mendes is notorious as a location where a goat mated with a woman? Well, this is in fact just the sort of implicit augmentation and/or correction of Herodotus's account which Strabo indulges in frequently in Book 17 of the Geography. In this case, Herodotus's account is not refuted, but enhanced with additional evidence concerning the relationship between Mendesian goats and women. Strabo is thus ensuring that the reader who is already familiar with Herodotus' account of Egypt, which was after all the most famous account of that country in the ancient Greco-Roman world, is aware that he has something further to add as well to this discussion. So in this way, Strabo has something of an ulterior motive for citing Pindar in this instance, since it plays into the meta-Herodotean discourse which imbues his entire Egyptian account. So this is, of course, not to say that we can be absolutely certain that Fragment 201 does not belong to a poem that belongs to the god Pan or relates to the god Pan, but it does somewhat weaken the assumption that this absolutely must be the case, just because Pan is mentioned in the Herodotean accounts as well. What we do know is that Fragment 201 definitely does not belong to Pindar's most famous poem concerning that particular god. Pindar wrote a famous hymn to Pan, but since that poem is in Aeolic meter, while the lines cited in Strabo are in dactyloepitrite, that means that this fragment that we have doesn't come from a hymn to Pan, so that would be the most obvious place to posit that it might belong to if we were to want to connect these lines to Pan specifically. Of course, this weakening of the assumption that these lines must somehow relate to Pan does not actually help us to say more about the type of poem that these verses actually came from in the first place. Like in an early Socratic dialogue, we seem only here to have hit a point of increased confusion and aporia rather than further elucidation. But since we've now reached the limits, or almost the very limits, of what we can do with the Greek sources on this fragment and their context, I now propose instead to turn to the Egyptological evidence to try and advance our understanding of what's happening in this Greek text and its sources further. So the first thing that's immediately noticeable when looking at Fragment 201 in relation to the Egyptian sources on Mendes is that something peculiar has happened in terms of the Greeks' understanding of that town's cult from the time of Pindar onwards. Throughout Egyptian history, Mendes had been well known as the namesake of a nome and a branch of the Nile. It later became an increasingly significant trading hub, as I mentioned before, and even at one point during the 29th dynasty, it was the capital of Egypt. Mendes was also known throughout its history as a prominent religious centre. The town was particularly well known as the home of the god Banebdjedet, whose name means bar of the Lord of Mendes. Djedet is the Egyptian name for Mendes, and bar has a double meaning here. It means both soul and ram. And the latter meaning is particularly interesting since Banebdjedet was actually a ram-headed god. He was not a goat-headed god, as the Greek sources continuously seem to suggest. And in fact, he's so strongly associated with rams in the Egyptian tradition that he is sometimes represented not just with one ram head, but with four, as you can see in some of the objects here, some of the pictures on this slide. Now, at first, this slight caprid confusion between goats and rams might seem like an insignificant point in our Greek sources, at least at first glance, but as we shall see in just a moment, the difference between rams and gods is actually worth taking account of in this particular instance. There are certain other things about Banebdjedet and his cult at Mendes which are also worth bearing in mind. As suggested by our Greek sources, there was indeed a cult animal, a kind of single special cult animal, chosen specifically because of its markings, that was kept in splendor in the temple precinct there and worshipped as a sort of substantiation of the god, again, much like the Apis bull. And archaeologists have found the remains of many ram sarcophagi at the site, and it seems that this cult continued for many centuries, even after the lifetimes of Pindar and Herodotus. But from what I can see in the archaeological reports, there was no evidence that goats were ever worshipped or buried in Mendes. On the contrary, the cult seems to have always remained firmly ram-centric, and any mention of goats in relation to Mendes is technically incorrect. How then do we account for the Greeks' caprid confusion, especially since there would presumably have been a certain amount of contact with and knowledge of Mendes even in the 5th century BC and certainly afterwards as well? How does Pan come to be associated with this particular ram cult? There are several possible aspects to this answer. The first and most obvious is Banebdjedet's strong association with fertility. He is a god who's worshipped for the great generative power of his phallus. And in this respect, the Greeks' association of the Egyptian god with sexual activity thus seems to be correct. So we can understand to some extent why there might have been an impulse to syncretize the ram god Banebdjedet with the Greek goat god Pan. After all, the Greek iconographical tradition, in the Greek iconographical tradition, Pan's depiction has generally started out with some exceedingly goaty elements, not least his head, which in the earliest examples is a full goat's head attached to a human body in the style of an archetypal Egyptian animal god, as you can see in the first vase painting on the slide here on the left. And it was only over time that Pan's depictions tended to focus more on his human elements rather than just his goat-like ones, as the second vase painting on the slide shows. Over time, gradually, Pan became less goaty, at least in terms of having a goat head stuck onto a human body. So it might not be surprising then that in the first half of the 5th century BCE, a Greek glimpse of the iconography of the Mendesian ram god Banebdjedet might have somehow evoked comparisons with images and ideas of Pan, and other Egyptian animal-headed gods would be evoked by Pan as well. But this again only goes some way to providing a potential answer to the question of why the Greeks sometimes associated this particular Egyptian god, Banebdjedet, with goats and with Pan. Because outside the Nile Delta, there are many other ram gods associated with fertility in Egypt who are not treated in a similar way by the Greeks. For example, the god Khnum occupies a similar role in Upper Egypt, and Amun-Re, who later becomes Zeus Ammon in the Greek world, never shares a similar goatee fate, despite being equally well known to the Greeks and sharing almost identical iconography and associations with creation and fertility. Moreover, there was already a well-established Greek syncretism for Pan by the time of Herodotus and Pindar. In general, the goat god was associated most often with the constantly priapic fertility god Min, whose iconography almost always included an enormous erect phallus. Indeed, this syncretism becomes well known and well established among the Greeks. Min's city of Kent Min even becomes known as Panopolis in Greek, whereas outside of Herodotus and the account of Strabo, which is heavily engaging, as I've already suggested, with that specific passage of Herodotus' histories, we have no evidence elsewhere of any particularly strong association between Pan and the god of Mendes. What then is so special about the Ram of Mendes in comparison to Egyptians' other prominent ram cults? So in once again diving into the Egyptological evidence, we discover that our Greek sources are accurate about the Ram of Mendes on one score. He may not be a goat, but he is indeed a fan of the ladies. Pindar fragment 201 does then seem to reflect this particular aspect of Mendesian cult accurately, as we can see if we turn to some of the Ram-God Banebdjedet's cult titles and iconography. For example, some of his titles and invocations include procreating ram who mounts the beauties, and apparently in the Egyptian here, the beauties in question could refer either to female sheep or to human women, it's not clear. Copulating bull, reproducer who makes love, sovereign ejaculator, your business is mating, you penetrate the beauties, etc., etc., etc. And as you can also see here as well, there is some iconographical evidence for this connection between the ram god and human women. We have a mold here found near Mendes, an image of which you can see here on the slide. So as you can see from these examples, the Ram-God of Mendes does indeed seem to have quite an appetite for the beauties, and this is a metaphor, at least I hope, for the help that the god might render to those who prayed to him for aid with conception, rather than a literal illustration of activities in the god's temple precinct, but who knows. So what does all of this allow us to say about Pindar fragment 201? Clearly, Pindar had some real knowledge about the cult at Mendes. He's wrong that the animal in question is a goat, but right about the fact that the god is associated, at the very least metaphorically, with erotic activities with human women rather than necessarily with other goats. This leads to the question of Pan and whether some sort of connection with the god is the only sensible suggestion concerning fragment 201. I believe that this is possible, but that there is also one other option which we need to take account of, since we have testimony that strongly link Pindar to another Egyptian ram god, and that is, of course, Zeus Ammon. So according to the Scholia on Pythian 9.53, Pindar seems to have opened a hymn to Ammon with the words Ammon, master of Olympus, and it's clear that in this poem he's equating the Egyptian god with Zeus. We also have an intriguing account in Pausanias telling us that Pindar dedicated a statue of Ammon in his hometown of Thebes, and that he sent a hymn for the god to the Ammonians in Libya. So this seems to be the opening, perhaps, of that hymn, which Pindar was supposed to have sent to the Ammonians in Libya, and which he had inscribed and set up in his hometown. We also know that the worship of Zeus Ammon was particularly popular among the Cyreneans, and that Pindar had strong links with the Cyrenean elite. You'll recall it in Pythian 4, an ode for Arcesilaus of Cyrene. Pindar mentions Cyrene's connection to the foundations of Zeus Ammon and the wealthy precinct of the son of Cronos by the Nile. So we can see here that Pindar is well aware of the importance of Zeus Ammon among his Cyrenean patrons. And it also seems that our poet had a special interest himself in this particular Egyptian cult, in which rams also played a central role. Now, if we return back to Herodotus' account of Mendes and its goats at 2.42 to 46, with this in mind, then there's another potential Cyrenean connection here of which we perhaps need to take note. While differentiating between the sacrificial practices of those who worship Ammon, i.e. those who avoid sheep, as Herodotus tells us, while differentiating these from those who worship the Mendesian god, who are supposedly avoiding goats, Herodotus does also mention the Ammonians, the people who inhabit the area in Cyrene around the oracle of Zeus Ammon at Siwa. Now, it's long been suggested here that Herodotus is drawing on Cyrenean sources in this section of the histories because of this particular interest in Ammon and Siwa, which is appearing in this passage and elsewhere. And given Pindar's Cyrenean connections, I wonder whether such a perspective may be colouring his description of Mendes as well. As the centre of another prominent ram-based Egyptian cult with potential access to the Greek world through trading connections, Mendes becomes a rival location which potentially threatens Cyrene's current stranglehold over the domain of influential Graeco-Egyptian syncretic gods. And to my mind, the idea that the Cyreneans might be behind the idea that the ram should be reserved for Zeus Ammon, since the lusty Ram of Mendes is in fact a goat, is an attractive one, given Pindar's evident interest in the Cyrenean cult and Herodotus's mention of Ammon in connection with the Mendesian god as well. Does this mean then that we should connect fragment 201 to Pindar's hymn to Ammon? It's a suggestion that's been made before, at least as far back as the commentary of Hartung, who notes that Pindar's Egyptian interests particularly centre around Zeus Ammon, and therefore links this Egyptian-themed fragment to the hymn simply because it also mentions Egypt. I think the connections and parallels between Ammonian rams and Banebdjedet's goats at Mendes, via the means of some erroneously lusty goats and erroneous lusty goats and potential Cyrenean urges to differentiate their own Graeco-Egyptian ram cult in the rest of the Greek world, certainly makes this suggestion one that we should perhaps consider more seriously, even if certainty on this point still eludes us in the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess, for this fascinating paper on such a complex topic. I'm sure there will be many questions. If you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, you can do this two ways. Either type in the chat and we will read it for you, or you can just use Zoom's raise hand feature and ask your question. So now is the time to ask Jess. Okay, I'll go straight to the chat. Jess, can you see the chat? We have a comment from Beatriz Caballero. Hello, everyone. Apologies, but I can. Okay, no microphone. Congrats to Jess for the amazing talk. My questions comes more from curiosity. In the more human portrait of Pan that you showed, he looked very similar to Dionysus, a god that had connections with satyrs and ram elements, as well as with Pan. I was wondering how the cult of Dionysus and the god might connect to this, if that connection even happens.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a really interesting comment, a really interesting question. There isn't much connection as far as I can kind of see explicitly between Dionysus and any of this particular material. But you know, you're right that those kind of iconographical similarities are there, and I don't think that's a necessarily a kind of coincidence. I think here we're dealing with this kind of complex world of syncretic gods taking elements from each other and from different cultures, and taking on kind of shared uses and domains. So this kind of fertility domain is very much there, both with Pan and the Egyptian gods I've been thinking about, and to some extent with Dionysus as well. This connection between Dionysus and the East is very interesting. Obviously, Dionysus very often associated with lands further in the East, all the way to India, but still in the Greek imagination, this idea of Dionysus being connected with places to the east of Greece is very strong. Pan, of course, interesting because he's, in contrast, very much always associated with Greece itself, you know, the kind of hills and countryside of Greece. But again, there a connection with Dionysus through this link with the kind of wild and the outdoors, etc., etc. So, I mean, what your comment really kind of hits upon there is this complex world of representations of the gods in this period in Greece, and we can see again just how many elements these representations are taking from other cultures, not just Greek culture. So thank you.
I was also wondering, but maybe this is a silly idea, but I'll say it nevertheless, that Banebdjedet, so the god of the Egyptian god of Mendes, is an Osirian god, and Osiris is about, and there is a connection between Osiris and Dionysus, so there might be something there, but I'm not sure.
Absolutely. No, thank you. I'll have to look into that further. That's yeah. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but yeah. Thank you.
Another comment from Tim Rowe. What do you think is the link between Pindar and Herodotus? Is your suggestion that Herodotus accepted Cyrenean portrayal of the Mendesian cult?
Yeah, so this is something constantly that's kind of been on my mind while I've been looking at this material. Both figures kind of contemporaneous, and so it's very difficult to sort of think about any kind of influence, which way it goes. Is it the fact that Herodotus is reading Pindar's hymn to Ammon, or whatever poem this fragment comes from? Is it the other way around? Is Pindar sort of taking inspiration from Herodotus? That's much more unlikely, of course, for chronological reasons. I think it's not impossible that Herodotus has Pindar's poem in mind when he's writing this account. I think as well, and maybe as your question hints at, this kind of shared Cyrenean background that's being kind of hinted at here and that we can potentially unearth. It has long been suggested that some of these elements in that passage of Herodotus are influenced by Cyrenean sources. Of course, it's difficult for us to say anything certain on that score, but I do find that, you know, quite convincing in many respects. And as I said before as well, we certainly know that Pindar has very, very strong connections to the Cyrenean elite and to Cyrenean patrons, and indeed to this very Cyrenean cult of Zeus Ammon. So I wouldn't be surprised if this kind of Cyrenean idea, I hesitate to say Cyrenean propaganda, that's designed to differentiate their own Greek cult, Greco-Egyptian cult, from other potential Egyptian cults, which Greeks may be finding out about, is there in the background here.
Peter, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you. I've got a question, and then just a comment about the Cyrenean thing. The question relates to the way in which the central fact, the interaction between the goats of Mendes and the women, is framed in Pindar's text and then in Herodotus's text. Pindar seems to talk about it, doesn't he, as a kind of as something which goes on. You know, it's something that's always happening. It's happening now. It's happened in the past. Herodotus. There are two little things that I noticed in Herodotus's Greek. I've just looked at it again after a long time away. And the first thing is he says that this is a teras. It's a wonder which took place epimou in my time.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing is that he says that this then tuto es epidexin anthropon apiketo. This somehow got out into the epidexis of men. Now, you know, if we apiketo, for me, when I first read it, seemed to imply that this is sort of a shameful thing, which this is a shameful scandal, a kind of you know, Cretan tale. But on the other hand, we have the possibility that epidexis doesn't mean that necessarily. I think it must mean something more like the oral tradition. So you know, I was wondering whether you had any thoughts about that and about what Herodotus might be meaning. The second point, which I just wanted to comment in relation to what Tim just asked and your comments on it, which, you know, I find it very convincing, was that Irad Malkin famously, in connection with this idea of a temenos of Ammon, he argues in his big book on Dorian colonization that this is in fact a kind of charter myth for the Cyreneans to push as far as they can past the oasis of Siwa down into the Nile Valley, and that it's a way of articulating through this Egyptian form of Zeus, Cyrene's control over, or imaginary control over these huge spaces. Of course, the Greeks never got that far. They didn't even get as far as Siwa, but they're articulating a claim of Siwa through this figure of the ram Zeus. Yeah. Okay, sorry.
No, thank you. Thanks for both points there. Yeah, no, I think the difference in the way these incidents are framed is indeed striking. And to be honest, I don't quite know what to make of it and what it kind of tells us about the relation between these two texts. Freudian slip. Yeah, you're right. In the Pindar fragment, it is kind of habitual 24/7 goat shagging is kind of the idea that we're getting there, isn't it? You know, this happens all the time. And I've always kind of read this Herodotus passage. It's kind of Daily Mail sidebar of shame kind of thing. It's like the shocking story, the gossip, the BuzzFeed article. It's got that kind of tone to it. He just kind of drops it in there at the end of the account. This kind of rather scholarly and serious account. He's unpicking elements of Egyptian religion and Greek religion, and then we get this. Oh, and by the way, you know that one time this goat and a woman in Mendes. But you're right. There's a real difference there in the way that those incidents are presented. Is this the same tradition which is kind of filtering through and being understood differently in these two texts? Does Herodotus know the Pindaric poem and is somehow, for some reason, choosing to present this as a kind of clickbait kind of moment that wants us to keep reading? I just don't know. I've not kind of finished.
Yeah, I mean, I have this idea and this vision in my mind of, you know, Herodotus going into a bar in, I don't know, Naucratis or Mendes and meeting a Greek merchant, and the two of them sit down, and, you know, after several ridiculously big kylixes of wine, you know, the merchant bursts out, "But did you hear about the story about the goat in Mendes?"
Yeah.
You know?
Precisely. It is the kind of thing that you can just imagine coming up with a trade.
So maybe something that's in circulation in the oral tradition of the Greeks of Egypt.
Yeah,
Possibly.
definitely, and then kind
And
of
which could take different forms in the folklore.
yeah. So it's clearly there, isn't it? It's in this period. It's very much being reported and traveling, and you get a real sense of it kind of coming up the Nile and into Greece, which I just find fascinating with this tiny fragment, which just so happens to connect to this Herodotean text. So yeah, thank you for that. And in terms of you mentioned Melkin and these broader ideas about potential kind of Cyrenean self-fashioning. I'm very taken with that idea. I've started to think about that a little bit. Didn't have time to go into it today, but I mean that's very much the kind of sense I'm getting from looking at the broader material and kind of where I'd want to push this paper. I think you know, these ram cults, and correct me, Egyptologists, and augment this and add to this discussion, please. But there are lots of them. They're very prominent. My sense from the reading I'd done is that perhaps there could be sort of rival, you know, rivalrous aspects of these different cults and the areas they control and where they become prominent and or not at various different times. And I wonder if this is the kind of Cyreneans also kind of getting in on that and these kind of elements being reflected there. And we're getting this through a kind of very distorted end Greek vision, Greek frame at the end, where it's quite difficult for us to disentangle precisely how these rivalries were happening. But I wonder if that's there in the background somewhere.
Thanks, Jess.
Thanks.
Yeah. Christopher, would you like to go ahead with your question?
Yes, sure. On that question, on that very sentence at the end of 246, just a matter of interest, might interest people. For my sins, I'm doing a new version with the lower translation. And I remember actually agonizing at some length about how to translate that, as I didn't know what it meant either. And particularly epideixin, you know, the idea of showing, the fact it was anaphandon, it was open. I mean, one possibility is it meant that no, everybody was crowding around, saying, "Oh, have a look at that! Oh, that's fancy." Actually, at the time, people were noticing. You know, it was a bit of a show-off, really, wasn't it? Doing it in public, for heaven's sake. But then, you know, I wasn't content with that either. And also, like Peter, I was wondering, you know, is it perhaps rather a thing of what happened afterwards? After all, if it's a monstrous thing, it suggests it's a sign of something to come. People carrying on talking about it, you know, they lecturing about it. It was really because of that, or it was a sign of X or Y or Z. So eventually, I just, you know, weakened and had something very ambiguous. And let me see what I put. I think this attracted great public attention, which was, I hope, ambiguous between the public gathering around at the time or people talking about it later. But I think it is, well, indeed, it may be Herodotus was being ambiguous as well. But it is a very interesting passage. And thanks, Jess. It's a fascinating paper.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to see you, and thanks for that. Yeah, I think that word terras is just really important here. I didn't mention it when Peter mentioned it before, but it is something that's wondrous and strange, but also monstrous is very much kind of there in the background of that word. This is something that's horrifying, amazing, something we want to know about and hear about and pay attention to, but not in a good way, really. This is something that, as you suggest, probably points to something possibly wrong in the future as well, definitely wrong now and having kind of ongoing effects. I think Herodotus is being a bit ambiguous here. He certainly is all through this passage when it comes to talking about the Mendesians. He won't mention specifically what it is that this god is known for, but it's clearly this kind of fertility element and this kind of imagery. He's kind of hinting at that all the way through. So I think it's an example of him having it both ways. He's wanting to kind of convey this gossip, but not going all the way and kind of giving us every single juicy detail. It's that kind of strange mix of the two, which Herodotus is so good at leading us on with very often.
Okay, any more questions from the audience? And maybe a small comment again in the meanwhile. I was just wondering, and maybe I'm not right, but there might be a reason for this seeming confusion between rams and goats and the need to differentiate between them. That if you consider the Egyptian, you mentioned the rival cults of ram gods in Egypt and all these prominent cults, which we have, but what we do not really have is cults of goat gods. So maybe that added to the problem of not finding a real equivalent. So they had to make do with ram gods. Does that make any sense?
Yes, it does. I spent an inordinate amount of time reading about species of various different caprids in
Yeah.
Egypt and how the iconography reflects earlier rams or goats that became extinct. I can't remember the details, but at one point I was totally in control of this information. But it seemed to me at least, in my ignorance, looking at the Egyptological sources, that there is a kind of problem to some extent as well with the iconography and the actual different types of caprids available, at least on the Egyptian side. And then, of course, the Greeks are very familiar with goats and happy to see goats in this iconography on occasion as well. So there is a very complex world of caprid species, which I won't bore everyone with, but it was certainly an interesting question.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there are goats in Egypt, but they are not on the divine. Somehow they are not associated with the divine.
Unlike in Greece.
Okay, something else in the chat from Whiteside. Do you envision going more in depth in the Egyptological material on Banebdjedet's cult and seeing whether this matches with details of Herodotus' description other than the mismatch of goat and ram?
Absolutely. I'd love to. I kind of feel like I've only just been dipping my toe into the Egyptological evidence, and there was enough there to already entice me to think about this question in much more detail, and these broader questions as well about Greco-Egyptian interaction in this period, particularly kind of trying to link this up with what Peter was talking about before, with these ideas about Cyrenean influence and self-fashioning in this period and later. I'd love to kind of start going down that route, and I hope I can, using these little lines of Pindar as a sort of a starting point, which I must confess I just started looking into because I was looking at Strabo and thought, oh, that's strange. What's going on with goats here? It's one of those unintended black holes that I've fallen into. I think it's giving me lots of valuable ideas about cultural exchange to think about in more detail.
Anybody else with questions? Last chance. Well, if not, then I think I wish to thank Jess for this wonderful paper. Thank you for coming and accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much.
And we will meet again once more before summer breaks at the end of June. So we'd be glad to see everyone again. Goodbye and thank you.
Thank you. Bye.